Cowboy leader slapped the obese girl in front of everyone. The mountain man destroyed his squad by morning. The autumn wind swept across the Tennessee frontier with a bitter edge that promised an early winter. In the settlement of Red Creek, a ramshackle collection of log cabins and rough timber buildings clinging to the banks of the Cumberland River, life moved to the rhythm of survival. It was 1794, and the wilderness still held dominion over most of the land, its dark forests and hidden valleys concealing dangers both natural and human. Sarah Hutchins stood outside Widow Morrison's trading post, her round face flushed from exertion as she struggled with a barrel of salted pork. At 19 years old, Sarah had never been slight, but the hardships of frontier life had done nothing to diminish her substantial frame. Her mother had died 3 winters past, leaving Sarah to care for her aging father and 2 younger brothers. The townspeople whispered about her weight, though most kept their thoughts private. Sarah had proven herself strong, capable, and possessed of a sharp mind for figures that made her invaluable to the widow's business. "Let me help you with that, Miss Sarah," came a gruff but gentle voice. Sarah looked up to see Ezekiel Stone approaching, his massive frame casting a long shadow in the afternoon sun. Ezekiel was a mountain man, one of the solitary trappers who ventured deep into the wilderness for months at a time, emerging only to trade their furs and resupply. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders that seemed broad enough to block a doorway. His dark hair hung past his shoulders, and a thick beard covered much of his weathered face. But it was his eyes that people noticed, most pale gray eyes that seemed to see everything and miss nothing. "Thank you kindly, Mr. Stone," Sarah said, stepping back as Ezekiel lifted the barrel as if it weighed no more than a child's toy. He carried it into the trading post and set it down where the widow directed. "Much obliged, Ezekiel," the widow said. "Sarah, dear, would you fetch the ledger? Mr. Stone will be wanting to settle his account." As Sarah retrieved the heavy book, Ezekiel noticed the purple bruise on her wrist, barely visible beneath her sleeve. His eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. Sarah caught his gaze and quickly pulled her sleeve down, a flash of shame crossing her face. Their business concluded, Ezekiel stepped back outside, intending to head to his camp in the hills above town. But the sound of approaching horses made him pause. A group of riders thundered into Red Creek's main street, their arrival sending chickens scattering and drawing nervous glances from the townspeople. There were 8 of them, and they rode with the casual arrogance of men accustomed to being feared. At their head was Caleb Murdoch, a man who called himself a cattle driver, though everyone knew his real business was considerably darker. Murdoch was tall and lean, with a cruel mouth and eyes that held no warmth. His gang operated throughout the Cumberland region, stealing livestock, terrorizing isolated homesteads, and occasionally robbing travelers foolish enough to carry obvious wealth. The local authorities were either too weak or too corrupt to stop them. Murdoch had connections with certain officials in Nashville, and he made sure everyone knew it. Red Creek existed in a gray area of frontier justice, too remote for regular law enforcement, but close enough to civilization that outright massacre would draw attention. Murdoch exploited this perfectly, taking what he wanted while staying just shy of the line that would provoke a real response. Sarah emerged from the trading post just as Murdoch's gang dismounted. She froze, recognizing the men who had caused so much suffering in recent months. Her hand instinctively moved to her bruised wrist. "Well, well," Murdoch drawled, his voice carrying across the street. "If it ain't the fat sow from the trading post, where's that old witch who runs the place?" Several of his men laughed, crude and harsh sounds that made Sarah's face burn with humiliation. She tried to move past them, but one of the gang members, a scarred man named Pike, stepped into her path. "Boss asked you a question, girl," Pike said, grinning to show broken teeth. "Widow Morrison is inside," Sarah said quietly, trying to keep her voice steady. "If you have business with her, you can go in." "Hear that, boys?" Murdoch said, swinging down from his saddle. "She's giving us permission to go into the trading post. How generous of the fat pig." More laughter. Sarah's face reddened further, but she held her ground. "Please, let me pass." Murdoch's expression changed, his amusement curdling into something uglier. "Please? You think you can just waddle away when I'm talking to you?" He stepped closer, invading her space. "You need to learn some manners, girl. Need to learn your place." Sarah tried to step around him, but Murdoch grabbed her arm, the same arm with the bruised wrist. She gasped in pain, and his grip tightened. "Let go of me," she said, her voice rising. "Or what?" Murdoch's face was inches from hers now. "What's a fat, useless sow like you gonna do about it?" The street had gone quiet. Townspeople watched from doorways and windows, their faces reflecting a mixture of sympathy and fear. No one moved to help. Everyone knew what happened to those who crossed Caleb Murdoch. Everyone except Ezekiel Stone. The mountain man stood near his horse, absolutely still, his gray eyes fixed on the scene unfolding before him. Something in his posture had changed, a subtle shift that made him seem suddenly more dangerous, like a wolf that had just caught the scent of prey. Sarah wrenched her arm free, stumbling backward. Murdoch's hand shot out and grabbed the front of her dress, yanking her forward. The fabric tore with a loud rip, exposing her chemise underneath. Sarah cried out in shock and humiliation, tears starting to stream down her face. That was when Murdoch slapped her. The crack of his palm against her cheek echoed down the street like a gunshot. Sarah fell to the dirt, one hand pressed to her reddening face, sobbing openly now. The men laughed louder, Murdoch loudest of all. "That's what happens when you don't show proper respect," Murdoch said, standing over her. "Maybe next time you'll remember your—" He never finished the sentence. Ezekiel's hand clamped down on Murdoch's shoulder and spun him around with enough force to nearly pull him off his feet. Before Murdoch could react, Ezekiel's other hand had seized the front of his shirt, lifting him up onto his toes. "You made a mistake," Ezekiel said quietly. His voice was calm, almost conversational, but there was something in it that made the hair on the back of Murdoch's neck stand up. For a moment, genuine fear flickered in Murdoch's eyes. Then his men moved, hands reaching for weapons, and his courage returned. "You got a death wish, old man?" Murdoch sneered. "There's 8 of us and 1 of you. Even a mountain savage can count that high, can't you?" Ezekiel's expression didn't change. He simply released Murdoch with a slight push that sent the gang leader stumbling backward. Then, without a word, he helped Sarah to her feet, his touch surprisingly gentle for such a large man. He shrugged off his buckskin coat and draped it over her shoulders, covering her torn dress. "Get inside," he told her softly. "You're safe now." Sarah hesitated, looking up into his weathered face. "They'll kill you," she whispered. "No," Ezekiel said, "they won't." Murdoch had recovered himself, his face flushed with rage. "You're a dead man walking, Stone. Dead man walking. Nobody lays hands on Caleb Murdoch and lives to tell about it." Ezekiel turned to face him, and the entire gang took an involuntary step backward. There was something in the mountain man's eyes now, something cold and ancient and absolutely merciless. "You hit that girl," Ezekiel said. "You humiliated her in front of her whole town. You think that makes you strong, makes you a man?" He shook his head slowly. "All it makes you is a coward, and I've killed better men than you for less." Murdoch's hand dropped to the pistol at his belt, but Pike grabbed his arm, whispering urgently in his ear. Murdoch listened, then a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "You're right, Pike. No need to dirty our hands in front of all these good people." He looked back at Ezekiel. "You think you're tough, mountain man? You think you can stand against all of us? Fine. We'll be camping at Devil's Bend tonight. You know where that is? Course you do. You come find us after dark if you got the stones. We'll settle this proper-like away from the town." He swung back into his saddle, his men following suit. "And if you don't show, well, we'll just have to come back tomorrow and finish our business with that fat girl. Maybe teach her some more manners. Maybe teach the whole town what happens when they harbor folks who don't know their place." With that, they rode out, heading north toward the bend in the river where the cliffs rose steep and dark. Ezekiel stood in the street, watching them go, his face expressionless. Sarah emerged from the trading post, Widow Morrison beside her. The old woman looked at Ezekiel with worry in her eyes. "You can't go after them," she said. "It's suicide, Ezekiel. 8 armed men against one. They'll kill you." "Maybe," Ezekiel said. "But I gave my word to that girl that she was safe, and Murdoch made his intentions clear. If I don't go, they'll come back. They'll hurt her worse than they already have. Probably hurt others too, just to make their point." "Then we'll leave," Sarah said desperately. "Father and my brothers and I will pack up and go. Head to Nashville or back east or anywhere. You don't have to die for us." Ezekiel looked at her, really looked at her, and Sarah saw something in his eyes that made her throat tighten. It was the same look her father got sometimes when he talked about her mother, a mixture of sadness and determination and something deeper that she didn't quite understand. "You shouldn't have to leave your home because of men like that," he said, "and you sure as hell shouldn't have to live in fear of them coming back." He walked to his horse and began checking his weapons. He carried a long rifle, a tomahawk, 2 pistols, and a knife with a blade as long as a man's forearm. He had ammunition and powder, flint and steel, and other items that Sarah couldn't identify. "I'll need until nightfall to prepare," he said, speaking more to himself than to the women. "They'll expect me to come charging in like an angry bull. Instead, I'll come like smoke, like shadow." Widow Morrison put a hand on his arm. "Ezekiel, you were in the war, weren't you? Against the British?" He nodded once, curtly. "And before that?" "People say you lived with the Cherokee for a time." Another nod. The widow's voice dropped low. "They also say you did things during the war, things that made even the other soldiers afraid of you, things that earned you a different name among the tribes." Ezekiel's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. "Is it true?" she pressed. "Are you the man they called Ghost Walker?" The name seemed to hang in the air. Sarah had heard it before, whispered in campfire stories meant to frighten children. Ghost Walker had been a ranger during the Revolution, a man who moved through the wilderness like smoke, who could kill an entire British patrol without making a sound, who left nothing behind but bodies and terror. The Cherokee had named him, and even they had been wary of him. That was a long time ago. Ezekiel said finally, "I'm just a trapper now, just a man who lives in the mountains and wants to be left alone." "But you haven't forgotten how," the widow said. It wasn't a question. Ezekiel swung into his saddle. "I'll come back by morning. Keep Sarah inside. Keep the doors barred. If anyone else from Murdoch's gang shows up before then, you hide and stay hidden. Understand?" Both women nodded, though Sarah's eyes were still wet with tears. As Ezekiel rode out of town, heading not north toward Devil's Bend, but west toward the deep forest, Sarah called after him, "Why? Why are you doing this for me? You barely know me." Ezekiel paused, looking back over his shoulder. "I had a daughter once," he said quietly. "Long time ago. She would have been about your age now. She was a good girl, kind and strong. Some men hurt her bad. I wasn't there to protect her." His voice hardened. "I'm here now." Then he was gone, disappearing into the trees like smoke, dissipating in the wind. The sun set in a blaze of orange and red, painting the western sky the color of blood. At Devil's Bend, Caleb Murdoch's gang had made camp in a clearing near the river. They had built a large fire and were passing around bottles of whiskey, their voices loud and confident. "Think the mountain man will show?" asked Turner, a stocky man with a scar running from his eyebrow to his jaw. Murdoch laughed, taking a long pull from a bottle. "Doesn't matter. If he comes, we kill him. If he doesn't, we go back tomorrow and make an example of that fat girl. Either way, we win." Pike wasn't so sure. "I don't know, Caleb. Something about that old bastard bothered me. The way he moved, the way he looked at us. He's been in fights before, real fights." "So have we," Murdoch snapped. "We're 8 men with guns and knives and the sense God gave us. One old trapper ain't going to change nothing." But as darkness fell and the forest around them grew quiet, too quiet, some of the men began to feel uneasy. The normal sounds of the wilderness had faded away, leaving only the crackle of their fire and the rush of the river. Even the insects had gone silent. "I don't like this," muttered Davis, the youngest of the gang. "Feels wrong." "You're just spooked," Murdoch said, but even he kept his hand near his pistol. They had posted 2 sentries, Jenkins and Cobb, at opposite ends of the clearing. Both men were armed and alert, or at least they had been when they took their positions. Now, as the night deepened, they peered nervously into the darkness beyond the firelight. Jenkins never saw what killed him. One moment he was scanning the tree line, the next a hand clamped over his mouth from behind, while a knife slid between his ribs, angled up into his heart. He died without making a sound, his body lowered gently to the ground by hands that knew exactly how to kill quietly. Cobb lasted slightly longer. He heard a sound, the snap of a twig, and turned, raising his rifle. "Who's there?" he called out, trying to keep the fear from his voice. The tomahawk took him in the throat before he could fire. He fell choking, drowning in his own blood, his rifle clattering uselessly to the ground. Around the campfire 6 men remained, unaware that their number had already been reduced. Murdoch was telling a story about a robbery they'd pulled off near Knoxville when Pike suddenly stood up, his hand on his pistol. "Something's wrong," he said. "Jenkins should have checked in by now." "Probably fell asleep," Turner said, but he also reached for his weapon. Jenkins! Cobb! Murdoch called out. Get your asses back here! Only silence answered. Spread out! Murdoch ordered, all trace of drunkenness gone from his voice. Find them and watch each other's backs. The 6 men formed into pairs, moving cautiously toward where the sentries had been posted. They found Jenkins first, or rather, they found his body. He lay in the shadows just beyond the firelight, his sightless eyes staring up at the stars. Jesus Christ, Davis whispered. He's dead, throat cut. Before anyone could respond, a rifle shot cracked through the night. Turner spun and fell, a neat hole in his chest, dead before he hit the ground. The remaining 5 men dove for cover, firing wildly into the darkness. Where is he? Pike shouted. Where the hell is he? Another shot, and Davis screamed, clutching at his shattered shoulder. He crawled behind a log, whimpering in pain. Murdoch and the others had taken cover behind trees and rocks, their eyes searching desperately for a target. But there was nothing to see, only darkness and shadows that seemed to move and shift in ways that made no sense. He's out there, Murdoch said, his voice tight. 1 man, just 1 goddamn man. We can still take him. We just need to... The words died in his throat as Pike stepped backward and triggered a hidden snare. His leg was yanked out from under him, and he found himself dangling upside down from a tree branch, his pistol falling from his hand. Before he could scream, a throwing knife buried itself in his chest. He twitched once, twice, then went still. 4 men left. Murdoch, Harris, Yates, and the wounded Davis huddled together, backs against rocks, weapons pointed outward in all directions. The fire still burned, but it now seemed more of a liability than a comfort, making them visible while leaving everything beyond it shrouded in darkness. "We need to run," Harris said, his voice shaking. "Get to the horses and get the hell out of here." "The horses are on the other side of the clearing," Yates pointed out. "We'd be sitting ducks." "We're sitting ducks right here," Harris shot back. Davis's whimpering had grown louder, more desperate. "It hurts," he moaned. "God, it hurts so bad. I need a doctor. I need..." A shadow detached itself from the darkness behind them, and Davis's words ended in a wet gurgle. The others spun to see Ezekiel Stone standing over Davis's body, his knife dripping blood, his face utterly calm. Harris fired first, but Ezekiel was already moving. He rolled beneath the shot, came up next to Harris, and drove his knife up under the man's ribcage. Harris gasped, his eyes wide with shock and pain, and then Ezekiel was gone again, melting back into the shadows. Yates and Murdoch fired after him, their shots ricocheting off rocks but hitting nothing else. They reloaded frantically, their hands shaking. "3 of us left," Yates said, his voice high and tight. "He's killed 5 men in less than 10 minutes. 5 men. What the hell is he?" Murdoch didn't answer. He was remembering the widow's words, remembering the stories he'd heard about the ghost walker. He'd thought they were just tales, exaggerations meant to scare people. Now he knew better. A sound behind them made both men whirl, but it was just a branch falling. When they turned back, Yates was alone. Murdoch had vanished without a sound. Yates screamed, firing his pistol in all directions, spinning in circles like a madman. "Come out!" he shrieked. "Face me like a man. Stop hiding in the dark and face me." "All right," came a voice from directly behind him. Yates spun and found himself staring into Ezekiel's gray eyes. The mountain man stood close enough to touch, so close that Yates could see his own terrified face reflected in those cold, merciless eyes. "Please," Yates whispered, "please don't." Ezekiel's tomahawk ended his plea. Yates crumpled to the ground, and Ezekiel stepped over his body, moving deeper into the darkness where Murdoch had disappeared. The gang leader had run, abandoning his men, heading for the horses in a blind panic. But Ezekiel had anticipated this. He'd spooked the horses earlier, sent them scattering into the woods. Murdoch stumbled through the darkness, calling for his mount, finding nothing. Looking for something? Ezekiel's voice came from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the rocks and trees. Murdoch spun, his pistol extended, but he saw nothing. "Show yourself, damn you!" "You wanted to settle this proper-like, as I recall," Ezekiel said, his voice moving, circling. "Just you and me. Your gang is gone, all of them. Dead because you couldn't control yourself. Dead because you had to hit a defenseless girl." "She deserved it," Murdoch shouted into the darkness. "She was nothing, nobody, just a fat, useless—" He never saw the attack coming. Ezekiel emerged from the shadows like his namesake, a ghost, a specter of death. His tomahawk struck Murdoch's pistol, sending it flying. Then they were fighting hand to hand, and Murdoch realized with horror that he was completely outmatched. Ezekiel fought with the efficiency of a man who had killed many times before, his movements economical and brutally effective. He broke Murdoch's nose with a headbutt, shattered his knee with a kick, and when Murdoch fell, Ezekiel stood over him with his knife drawn. "Wait!" Murdoch gasped, blood streaming from his broken nose. "Wait, please. I got money. I got connections. I can make you rich. Just let me live. Let me go and I'll never come back here. I swear it." Ezekiel looked down at him without a trace of pity. "You humiliated that girl, hurt her, terrorized her town. You think money changes that? You think promises from a man like you mean anything?" "Please," Murdoch whimpered, "I'm begging you. I don't want to die." "Neither did your victims," Ezekiel said quietly. "Neither did my daughter." He drove the knife down, and Caleb Murdoch died in the dirt, alone and afraid, as far from the swaggering bully of earlier as it was possible to be. Ezekiel stood slowly, wiping his blade clean. Around him lay the bodies of 8 men, all dead by his hand. He felt no satisfaction in it, no triumph. Just a weary certainty that this had been necessary, that these men would have continued hurting innocent people if he hadn't stopped them. He gathered their weapons and horses, piling the guns together and tying the horses in a string. Then he built up the fire and sat beside it, waiting for dawn. He didn't sleep. He never slept after killing men. Instead, he thought about his daughter, about the life he'd lived, about the man he'd become. When the sun finally rose, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Ezekiel Stone mounted his horse and headed back toward Red Creek, leading the string of captured horses behind him. The town was just waking when Ezekiel rode in. People emerged from their homes cautiously, eyes widening, as they saw the mountain man leading 8 horses, the saddlebags bulging with weapons and whatever wealth Murdoch's gang had accumulated. Widow Morrison and Sarah stood outside the trading post, both of them pale and exhausted from a sleepless night. When Sarah saw Ezekiel, alive and apparently unharmed, she let out a sob of relief and ran to him. Ezekiel dismounted, and Sarah threw her arms around him, weeping into his chest. He stood awkwardly for a moment, then gently patted her shoulder. "It's done," he said quietly. "They won't be troubling anyone anymore." "All of them?" the widow asked. "All 8?" Ezekiel nodded once. A murmur ran through the gathered crowd. Some people looked relieved, others frightened. The blacksmith, a man named Cooper, stepped forward. "What about the law?" he asked. "When word gets out that you killed Murdoch and his whole gang, there'll be questions, maybe repercussions." "Murdoch didn't have as many friends as he claimed," Ezekiel said, "and those he did have won't care enough to investigate. As far as anyone else is concerned, his gang tried to rob the wrong trapper and paid the price. Self-defense. That's all anyone needs to know." He turned to the widow. "The horses and weapons are yours to sell. Whatever money they bring should be divided among the families Murdoch hurt. There's also some stolen property in the saddlebags, jewelry, coins, other things. Try to return what you can to its rightful owners." The widow nodded, tears in her eyes. "Thank you, Ezekiel. Thank you for what you did." But Ezekiel was looking at Sarah, who had stepped back, wiping her eyes. She met his gaze, and something passed between them, understanding, gratitude, and something deeper. "I'm sorry you had to see that," he said to her. "Sorry you had to go through any of this." "You saved me," Sarah said simply. "You saved all of us. I'll never forget that." Ezekiel shifted uncomfortably, unused to gratitude. "You're a strong woman, Miss Sarah, stronger than you know. Don't let anyone make you feel less than you are, not ever again." Sarah nodded, fresh tears streaming down her face, but this time they weren't tears of fear or humiliation. They were tears of something like hope. Ezekiel prepared to leave, to return to his solitary life in the mountains. But Sarah's father, old man Hutchins, approached him, leaning heavily on a walking stick. "Mr. Stone," he said, his voice trembling with age and emotion, "my daughter tells me you lost your own girl, lost her to men like these." Ezekiel's expression hardened, but he nodded. "Then you understand," Hutchins continued, "what it means to a father to know his child is safe. You gave that back to me tonight. You gave it back to all of us." He paused, then added, "There's always room in this town for a good man. If you ever tire of the mountains, if you ever want something different, you'd be welcome here." Ezekiel looked around at the gathered townspeople, at the rough buildings and muddy streets, at Sarah standing with her hands clasped in front of her, hope shining in her eyes. For a moment, just a moment, he allowed himself to imagine it. A life here, among people instead of alone. A chance to be something other than Ghost Walker, other than the killer in the darkness. But then he thought of the blood still drying on his hands, the bodies he'd left at Devil's Bend, the things he'd done during the war and after. He thought of the darkness that lived inside him, the capacity for violence that had served him well, but had also cost him everything he'd once loved. "Thank you," he said finally, "but the mountains are where I belong, where I need to be." He swung back into his saddle, tipped his hat to Sarah and the widow, and rode out of Red Creek, heading west, toward the deep wilderness where the trees grew tall and the silence was broken only by the wind and the calls of wild things. Sarah watched him go until he disappeared from sight, knowing she would probably never see him again, but also knowing that she would remember him for the rest of her life. The mountain man who had stood up for her when no one else would, who had made her feel, if only for a moment, that she mattered, that she was worth protecting. As the sun climbed higher, Red Creek returned to its normal rhythms. But something had changed. The fear that had hung over the town like a pall had lifted. People walked a little straighter, spoke a little louder. They had been reminded that evil could be fought, that bullies could be defeated, that sometimes justice came not from distant authorities, but from the courage of one good man. In the mountains, Ezekiel Stone made camp that night beneath a sky full of stars. He thought about Sarah, about her strength and kindness despite the cruelty she'd endured. He thought about his daughter, gone these many years, and allowed himself to hope that somewhere, somehow, she knew he'd finally done something right, that he'd protected someone who needed protecting, avenged someone who deserved avenging. The darkness still lived inside him. The capacity for violence remained, but maybe, just maybe, it could be turned toward something good, toward protecting the innocent instead of simply surviving, toward being more than just Ghost Walker, the specter that haunted men's nightmares. Maybe there was still a chance at redemption, even for a man like him. As sleep finally claimed him, Ezekiel dreamed not of blood and death, but of a young woman's smile, of gratitude shining in tear-filled eyes, of a town that stood a little bit taller because one man had chosen to do what was right instead of what was easy. And in Red Creek, Sarah Hutchins slept peacefully for the first time in months, knowing that the morning would bring not fear, but hope, that she could walk the streets without shame, hold her head high without worrying about cruel words or crueler hands. The mountain man had given her that, had given it to all of them. And though he was gone, his legacy remained a reminder that courage still existed in the world, that justice could still triumph, and that sometimes the darkest souls could bring the greatest light.